Hi everyone, this is Sophie. I'm an associate at Upworks. In this video, I'm going to talk about term sheet. Given the time limit, I will only cover the most important concept and the more impactful terms. For more details, I highly recommend everyone to read the Bible of VC deal term, which is Venture Deals, written by Brad Field and Jason Mendelson. All the information today is put into a deck. Welcome to download it and review at your own pace. To start, let's talk about what's a term sheet. Many of you may think it's just an initial intent of investment. However, I suggest taking it more seriously. What's in the term sheet is critical because it usually determines the final deal structure. For founders, I encourage you to treat it as a blueprint of your future relationship with your investors because the deals will largely determine how you interact and collaborate on critical matters in the future. Before we go into the details of each term, we should know the basic principle of a term sheet. First, it's a legal document. Remember, legal wording is supposed to help us protect the downside. This means most of the terms are to protect the interest when things go really bad and should never be about limiting the upside. Second, the mechanism of many terms is to align interests of all parties, which means founders, investors, and your employees. I'll be showing the two tag a lot today because I'll keep repeating them. Finally, these terms are to ensure the sustainability of the company. No matter what happened, how ugly, or who runs the company, there should be a mechanism for the company to make major decisions and avoid things left on no man's land. Among the terms, we can categorize them by three: economic terms, control terms, and other terms. We will talk about these three categories each. The categorization is from VC's perspective. After all, deal terms are more for investors to protect their downside. As a founder, you definitely want terms to be as less and light as possible. However, VC terms have evolved over 50 years since the very first deal in the world. How this term managed to keep all interest parties aligned and to avoid ignorance of major downside risks is still worth learning. The first category is economic terms. Economics refers to the return the investor ultimately gets and the terms that have direct impact on this return. Let's take a look what terms are in this category. These are the major terms under this category. The order does have a meaning here. They are the terms that work from the normal to the worst case situation. So for example, liquidation is a term that only applies when things go really bad. We will only cover two terms here today: vesting and liquidation preference. Let's see what I will skip today. Valuation. Valuation is an art, and I can either use 1 second or 10 hours with several models to talk about it. So we won't cover it here today. Option. Option is actually just part of the valuation. Anti-dilution. It is simply a calculation to help investors maintain their ownership when down round happens. Well, it sounds pretty fair, right? And pay to play. It is similar. It is quite a strong term to ask current investors to participate at least pro rata into a down round. Otherwise, they become common shareholders and lose all their favorable terms. I won't cover it because it is not that common nowadays, and there's no exact right or wrong having it or not. Pretty neutral about it. Now, let's go to our first term, vesting. To be more precise, this is about founder shares restriction. This is a term to protect the downside from founders' departure of the company. Let's take a look at how it is usually written in a term sheet. Okay, very long. I'm not going to read it. The key point here is to define the time frame, vesting over 4 years, how it is to be vested, 25% the first year, and the rest by quarterly. It also defines what to do when founder leaves, or any major M&A. I would say vesting is probably the most important term in the entire term sheet. It is a term with profound impact. Why? Because for the investors, founder is the most important asset to the company, especially at an early stage. So founders' commitment to the company is crucial and plays an important role in future potential economic return to investors' investment. This term effectively keeps founders' interests aligned with the company, with the investors. When there's a new round of investors joining onto the cap table, it is very common we see them require the founder to vest with another X years again. For founder, it is fair to investors to require such a term. But when you have multiple co-founders, this term also serves as a strong mechanism to keep these different co-founders' interests aligned. Let's try to visualize a bit here. Let's say if you're founder A and your co-founder is B. He has 100K shares today. He left after a year. What would he got if he under a typical 4-year vesting? Easy, right? He'll get 25%, so 25K shares when he leaves. The remaining 75% or 75K shares then would be returned to the company. It then depends on different practices in different countries. Some places, the company can repurchase it. Some has to cancel it right away. So now we know how and why this term works. We have some suggestions for you when setting this term. First, a common and friendly approach way is 4-year vesting with 1-year cliff, 25% at the first year, and the rest can go quarterly or monthly. Second, make sure you set the consistent vesting rules for every co-founder to avoid unnecessary conflict or imbalance. Third, even if you don't have any external investors, we still think vesting is necessary when you have multiple co-founders at your company. Now, we can move on to liquidation preference. This term impacts how the proceeds are shared in a liquidation event. This term is especially important in case a company is sold for less than the amount of capital invested. Let's take a look at how it's usually written on a term sheet. Great, it's shorter than vesting. The key point here is in what kind of liquidation event and who is in a superior position than who. In this case, Series A will get money before common shareholders. They can get X times of their investments. Let's pick up some keywords here. Liquidation event means a sale of the company, a majority of the assets. Simple. Preference, there are 2 types, stacked preference or pari passu. Stacked preference means there is a seniority of each round of investors. Pari passu means all the investors split together according to their proportion. The multiple of initial investment they can get back should also be determined here too. Very common case, we see one time, and the later rounds will take before the previous rounds and the common shareholders. Participation. It is another keyword to be defined in this term. To participate, it means the investor can get additional reward if there's leftover value after all the investors get their multiple of investments. Non-participation means the investor only get the promised multiple, but no more. Let's use some diagrams to show an example here. Say you have raised a round for $1 million and now your total post-money valuation is $5 million. The investor owns 20% of the company. After a year, you are selling this company at $2.5 million, less than the post-money valuation. So what happened now? The investor has 2 choices. First is to convert directly to common shares, as they can convert at any time. So their 20% holding will yield $0.5 million. Or the second choice is they don't convert. According to the liquidation term, they can get 1 time of their investment back. So they can carve out $1 million here. Of course, the investor will choose the second. That's why, as we highlighted, liquidation preferences is a term that only works when a company is not doing great and is sold at a lower valuation. Now you see how it protects the investor's downside. If the multiple is set at 2 times, then the investor gets $2 million here. If 3 times, then they can get the entire $2.5 million. Let's see how participation affects the results here. If the term set 1 time and full participation, in this case, investor will get $1 million plus 20% of the remaining value. So in total, it's $1.3 million. Occasionally, we can see a cap on the remaining value for the participation. Quite a friendly gesture compared to full participation. Now you know how this term works. For investors, it is a term to protect downside and to make sure they get their investment back before other parties, usually earlier investors and common shareholders. As someone comes later, they face a higher valuation risk, and hence this preference seems fair to them. For founders, I'd say it's a common term, so just be careful not to accept uncommon practices such as multiple preferences. Our suggestion for you when setting the term is better just be simple, especially when you're at early stage, because usually future rounds will follow the previous round. So once you accept a harsh term at beginning, there's no turning back unless you meet very kind and generous investors later on. So the simplest would be just one time and no participation. We see some investors prefer to participate. Our stand is, as we said, legal term is to protect downside rather than limit the upside. So when unfortunate things happen like fire sale, we as investors should already be pretty happy that we might still get one time back. Asking extra is just not actually moving the needle in terms of the entire risk reward to VC investment thesis. That potentially tells you who you're dealing with. This investor cares so much that even this is not moving a needle to them. Meanwhile, it could be a major amount for the founders. Stacked or pari passu is rather a neutral issue here. It really depends on the investors. Sometimes rounds are very close, so the risk they bear is not too much different. Then it seems fair to them to use pari passu. Most cases we've seen is a stack preference, as the later on investor want to enjoy a higher seniority to compensate the higher valuation risk they bear. Good, we covered the most important two terms in the first part. Now we can move on to the second part, the control terms. Let's recap a little bit. Economic terms cover those terms that affect the return to investors' investments. Control terms refers to the mechanisms that allow investors to affirmatively exercise control over the business or to veto certain decisions the company can make. They are mainly for investors to have a say in actions that could materially affect their investments. Let's take a look at the main terms under this category. First one is about the board. Protected provisions, or we say veto rights, for the investors to say no. Drag along is important. We won't cover conversion today because it's pretty straightforward. In general, it allows preferred shareholders to convert at any time to hold common shares. We already briefly mentioned it in the example we used for liquidation preferences. I hope you're still awake at this point. Hang on here, it is the last three. All right, so let's talk about board of directors. Simple. It is a term to define how to select board members. This is how it will look like on the term sheet. It will determine the size of the board, who can have how many seats. In this case, Series A and Common each would have some, and then how to determine the remaining seats. So usually a board will consist of three main parties: founder or CEO, investors, and non-founder, non-investor board members. For investors, it is a key control term. However, the key purpose is less about control per se, but to maintain a balanced control of the company among all stakeholders, such as founders and other investor directors. For founders, electing a board of directors is an important and delicate point. It should be less about personal control, but you should think from the angle that who and how can make the best decision for the company. So the key principle is to have a board that is balanced in power. Our suggestion for you when setting these terms are: better use an odd number like 3 or 5 or 7. An even number will result in even votes and end up a headache for you. The second situation is, let's say if you have a board of 5 seats, but you're just a solo founder. So you may want to keep 2 seats and give investors 2, and then the final one to be decided by everyone together. But you're just a solo founder, so what would you do with 2 seats? Some people will invite a senior or important staff or a family member. We think multiple votes can be a better approach here. you can cut the board from 5 to 4, 2 for investors, 1 for you, 1 for a mutually agreed person. But for your board seat, you can design it to be 2 votes, so that you effectively have equal number of seats to the investor without having to take the risk of picking a random person. The third is to repeat that balance in power. The fourth point here, the non-founder, non-investor seat is a good space to invite a good independent or professional outside member that will add value to the board. The final point here, many founders want to take the majority of the board. This is very understandable. You want an effective and supportive board. However, we can think about this reversely. A board that's functioning effectively and supportively without founders being the majority. This actually serves not only a strong corporate governance, but also a strong signal that founders is able to persuade and keep the board very aligned and function well. A strong plus when we look from outside. Okay, back to my face. So many slides. We're halfway there. The next control term is protective provisions. In short, it is the veto rights. This term is for investors to have veto-level control over a set of actions the company could take, especially when it impacts the VC's economic position. Implicitly, it covers those actions a company may do when facing major difficulties or making major decisions. It is an effective risk control. By listing these conditions clearly can eliminate the ambiguity when major decisions need to be made. It usually looks really long on the term sheet. First line is a condition before giving them such veto rights. So when the investors are still your investor with enough holding, and then the rest below are all the details for those things that investor can veto. They usually include these, which usually happens under major events. Anything that affects the status or the seniority of the terms or stocks investors own. Anything that creates potential dilution. Anything that changes the control of the company or the major assets. Closing or announcing the bankruptcy of the company. Major borrowings above a certain amount. For C round, we usually set the bar at $100K US each borrowing. To declare or pay any dividends. Nowadays, crypto is getting more common, so ICO or token-based financing could also be a major event too. For investors, this term is for them to effectively own the control right to protect the downside. We talked about board in the last session, so board this term is for the investor to balance the power, but veto rights here are really to control and avoid the downside risks. The fine difference here is that an investor director is still a board member, that their duty is to think the best for the company, not for themselves or for the fund or their LPs. That's why investors need these separate veto rights to guarantee their control over major issues. For founders, don't worry too much. This term will not eliminate the company's ability to conduct those actions. You can still make that call, but you just need an approval or support from your investors. This is a term that clearly defines potential major risk. It creates a room for discussion between all the stakeholders. So when it really happens, there's a mechanism of how to start the conversation and then how to make a decision. Our suggestion on setting this term is make sure all investors vote as a single class. You don't want to have different vetoes for different investors. What a mess here. A usual threshold is 50%. So as long as they remain 50% of their holding, they can have that right. When you set it too high, for example, at 90%, then effectively you're giving the rest 10% holder a bigger leverage to affect the decision here. Finally, be precise. Avoid ambiguous wording such as material impact, that no judge can help you when unfortunately you need to go on court with your investors. Okay, let's move on to the last term for today. Yay! The last term we will cover is drag along. This term gives the investors the ability to drag all shareholders together to do a sale of the company. Let's see how it looks like on a term sheet. So everyone enters into this agreement to allow Series A investors to drag everybody. The key point is who can drag. Other common cases we can see the dragging party include not only the majority of the investors, but also the majority of common shareholders, and sometimes the consent of the board. For investors, this term is for them to effectively own the control right to protect the downside, especially when things aren't falling apart. Veto is for them to say no. Drag along is for them to say yes to any last buyer at a usually fire sale stage. For founders, it may look scary as it appears that your investor can decide who you're selling to. However, when things are great, the company is growing, VC and your interest aligned, they won't randomly sell at a low price to hurt their return. Remember, VC usually aims for 100 times return, if not then at least 10 times. So this term is really effective when things aren't great. When things aren't great, there should be a lot of mess that requires a higher attention and urgency for a founder to deal with. Drag along allows a single decision to be made without endless argument between all stakeholders. This is a classy term that embodies the spirit of any legal term. Be exact and precise about the possible ugly things in advance, a very effective risk control. So a more friendly approach of this term is, first, setting the threshold to be majority of investor plus majority of common shareholders, so that investor can't make single decision without founders' agreement. Second, just like in the veto rights, whenever you are setting the percentage holding as a threshold, don't use something too high like 90%. Then you are leaving the rest 10% the real decision power. So now we have covered the most important 5 terms under economic and control terms. We can then finally touch upon other terms. Other terms have lower importance or are only impactful in a downside scenario, or they exist as a legacy. These are the most common terms that's not having too much to do with economics or control. Don't worry, I will just briefly introduce each and won't go into details. First, dividend. Definitely a legacy, because most startups won't even have the chance to even generate positive cash flows. Usually more important for later stage or private equity investment. Second, redemption. It means investors can decide to redeem their investment after several years. This one actually doesn't help much, as usually when the startup is not going anywhere, they won't even be able to redeem investors' money. But it does create an opportunity for investors to have a proper talk to the founder, like a last resort for final reconciliation, like a divorce at the final stage with the lawyers. Third, information rights. It's pretty fair to give important investors such right. The next one, right of first refusal. It will give investors the first right to buy any shares first if the company is issuing any. It is for the investors to maintain their pro rata or even increase their stake. For early investors, it actually is important as they are your early supporters, so they should have a chance to not be diluted or even increase their holding. Next, voting. Usually nothing special here. Most common is 1 vote, 1 share. Remember, being fair and maintaining balance between your investors is important. Don't try to be fancy here. Next, co-sell. So when the founder wants to sell, investors can sell together because you, the founder, are who we value the most. You jump, I jump. Finally, no shop. It means when you receive this term sheet, you can't look around. However, it's less about a restriction, but more a term to open a conversation. So let's say if you really get a super great offer from other investors or acquirer, you just need to properly talk to this investor who gave you the term sheet. A decent investor knows that the circle is actually small. We never want to make enemy, everybody is friend, want to hit the moon together. So a decent investor eventually won't block you from a really good deal either. You just also need to behave properly. Talk to all the parties with integrity and decency. That's it. All right, now we cover all the major terms that you will see in a term sheet. These are my final reminders, or what I have iterated 1,000 times in this video. First, term sheet is a first official conversation. Think of it as a blueprint of a future relationship with the investors. The spirit is to align interests of all parties. Legal terms are to protect downside rather than limit the upside. So if you see any term that's limiting the upside, be careful. A founder should think for the best interest for the company. Sometimes you may wonder why there are so many restrictions, but when you step away, you can imagine, what if this is someone else who's running your company for you? Then you may understand how and why this term is designed like this. Next, don't waste your time negotiate terms that don't matter. Remember, most terms only work when very bad things happen or they are purely a legacy and not that effective. Only focus on those important ones, or at least the 5 terms we covered today. Same applies to your counterparty. When you find the investors spending disproportionate energy on unimportant terms, they probably don't know what they are doing. Congratulations! We can conclude our class today. After this video, you should already know the basic structure of a term sheet. The most important 5 terms: vesting, liquidation preference, board of directors, veto rights, and drag along. You should also have a clue of the core spirit of a term sheet, that is to align the interests of all the stakeholders. For all the materials today, you should be able to find a link to the deck in the description of this video. For any question, you're very welcome to contact me through my email here or here. This is Sophie. See you next time. Bye bye.